This week has produced a spectacular batch of news stories highlighting the many contradictions facing us as we embark on the greatest technological transition in our history: abandoning fossil fuels. Shell, one of the world's largest oil companies, has been forced by a Dutch court to cut its emissions much faster than originally planned, 45% by 2030, with the court arguing that the company's decarbonization targets were incompatible with the Paris Agreement. The news, which could, and should, trigger a wave of similar cases around the world, coincides with increased pressure on the boards of two other of the world's largest oil companies, America's Exxon and Chevron, some of whose shareholders are demanding faster responses to the climate emergency, rather than merely greenwashing. The oil industry will find it increasingly difficult to ignore social pressure to reduce its emissions. We are facing a fundamental change, the end of the oil era, which could lead to a financial meltdown among the companies dedicated to exploiting a resource that is still far from being exhausted, but which is becoming increasingly uneconomical to exploit. Over the course of the next 30 years, 80% of the oil industry is set to disappear. Until now, the lies of the oil companies, whose contribution to the climate emergency had been covered up for many years, had allowed them to move toward increased output, but this now looks less and less likely. Yet the Biden administration is backing the Willow project in Alaska, which would produce 100,000 barrels of oil per day for 30 years at the expense of a permafrost zone, as well as impacting on fish, reindeer and polar bear populations, while seriously undermining the credibility of environmental objectives that had been a fundamental element of its electoral program. Unsurprisingly, the dirtiest of industries plays dirty politics. Meanwhile, on Tuesday, the International Energy Agency published a report with a clear roadmap for the global energy sector in which it calls on all countries to immediately halt approval of projects for new coal-fired power plants and oil and gas projects, as well as to rapidly phase out fossil fuel vehicles if they want to avoid the most catastrophic effects of climate change. And in Australia, a court has ruled that the state has a duty to protect younger generations from the climate emergency after a lawsuit was brought by 8 teenagers and an octogenarian nun seeking to halt a coal mine expansion project, in another case that could, and again, should be replicated soon in other countries. The combination of technologies that involved the exploitation of fossil fuels and the internal combustion engine brought enormous economic progress to mankind over many decades, but we now know at what cost.